Hello and welcome to the Political Opinions podcast, where every opinion is given equal footing and political tolerance and debate are given their proper attention in a world where both are on the decline. Today's episode will cover the different opinions regarding the situation involving Israeli occupation of former Palestinian territory. Following World War II, the territory of Palestine was partitioned by the United Kingdom and the United Nations into two different states. The state of Palestine, occupied by those of predominantly Islamic belief, and the territory of Israel, whose population is mostly Jewish. While tension was always present, the two nations coexisted relatively stably until 1967, during which the 6 Days War occurred. During this war, Israel occupied all, essentially, of Palestine's territory and brought it under Israeli control. This situation has continued to today, with Israel claiming sovereignty and occupying all of Palestinians' territory. The two most crucial areas are the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, both of which are populated by predominantly Palestinian people, but are occupied by Israeli security forces. The world is divided on how best to solve this situation, with some believing Israel is in the wrong and should return the territories of Palestine to its people, while others believe Israel is in the right and the Palestinians are a threat to Israel's security. This is obviously a very divisive issue, and I am conscious that I can barely scratch the surface of it in 10 to 20 minutes, and as such, the opinions I will discuss today will be limited purely to the occupation of territory and whether Palestinian land should be returned to the Palestinians or kept under Israeli control. I'm using the word occupation in accordance with terminology used by the United Nations to describe the presence of Israeli forces in what it has considered to be Palestinian territory since the 1947 partition. A very important reminder that the aim of this episode is not to take a side in this debate or any other political dispute covered. My aim is to remain neutral and merely highlight the different opinions on the topic and provide an unbiased comparison between them. No conclusions as to the outcome will be drawn, and I have used sources supporting both sides of the conflict, and have chosen my words as best possible to display neutrality. If anyone does feel I have failed to maintain neutrality, please make me aware, and I will do my best to rectify any mistakes I have made. With that being said, I will begin with the argument that Palestine should no longer be occupied by Israel, followed by the argument that the occupation should continue, with a comparison at the end. Israel's occupation of Palestine is considered to be illegal under international law. Numerous United Nations General Assembly resolutions have been passed to affirm that Israel's occupation is illegal, and therefore should be ended in accordance with global law. An illegal occupation has no reason to continue, and many argue Israel is clearly in breach of international laws. Furthermore, over 70% of the United Nations' 193 members recognize Palestine as an independent entity, and as such, it is clear that the world's law and nations, on the most part, do not support this occupation, and therefore many argue it should be ended. For many Palestinians, security means the end of foreign military occupation in their territory. It is a breach of Palestinian sovereignty to have a foreign entity occupying its territory, and therefore Israel should respect the sovereignty of its neighbour and end its occupation, allowing, once again, for Palestinian self-determination. Most of the Palestinian population lives in the occupied territories, and as such, Israel is occupying almost an entire ethnic group. The withdrawal of Israeli forces would therefore allow for a nation of ethnic Palestinians, which is something the vast majority of Palestinians want. This would allow both religious and ethnic groups to pursue their own dreams and have their own self-governance. Some argue that Palestine had the entire territory before Jewish settlers were granted land there by the United Nations post-World War II, and as such, Palestine has historic rights over the territory of both Israel and Palestine, and the entire area should be under Palestinian control, and as such, not only is the occupation illegal, but to some more extremists, the entire existence of an Israeli state is illegal. Some Palestinians also argue that Israelis are illegally settling in Palestinian territory to try and change the demographic of the area and make it more pro-Israel, and as such, Palestinians are being forced from their homes to make way for Jewish settlers, and therefore the occupation should end, as clearly the Palestinians are not being treated equally to their Israeli counterparts. Some argue also that Israeli security forces are extremely authoritarian with Palestinians, and some actions may even constitute a violation of human rights, and as such, Israel needs to withdraw its forces and stop persecuting and suppressing Palestinians in their own territories. The vast majority of Arab countries also oppose Israel's illegal occupation of Palestine, and so, by ending the occupation and creating two different states, some would argue that it would lead to better relations between Israel and its neighbours, which would improve Israel's security and make the entire region less volatile. And finally, an argument posed by those essentially in favour, or at least not necessarily outright denouncing Palestinian terror attacks. They argue that these attacks are merely a response to the desperation over the illegal occupation by Israeli forces, and people just want freedom, and therefore these acts of terror are a reason to end the occupation rather than continue it, because many would say that once the occupation is over, the Palestinians who are acting as terrorists would no longer need to, because they have achieved their aim. Those in the Israeli camp argue for the continued occupation of Palestinian territory on the grounds of security for Israel. Israel argues that its occupation is in self-defense and only takes place to ensure the security of its nation. Israel is surrounded by nations that are ethnically and, more importantly, religiously different to itself, and as such it feels surrounded by potential enemies. For this reason, Israel should continue the occupation because it helps guarantee security on its borders. By preventing Palestine from becoming a state, it also prevents the creation of another Arab state which would be hostile to Israel, and Israel may fear increased aggression as a result of the years of occupation it has undertaken. It is almost a certainty that Palestine, if it were an independent state, would build up some degree of armaments even if it's just for its own self-defense. However, in almost any situation like this, Israel would likely view the build-up of armament as hostile, and as such, the occupation should continue to ensure this cannot ever happen. Some argue that because of the issue of Jerusalem, the issue will likely never be solved, and there will be no peaceful resolution. Essentially, both sides claim Jerusalem to be their capital, and both sides oppose splitting the city in half if the two states were separated. And given that neither side will likely back down on such an important issue, some argue ending the occupation would actually lead to more conflict in the future. Many Jewish people also claim ancient ownership of this territory, and claim that given the land was occupied by Jews hundreds and thousands of years before even the emergence of Islam as a religion, the Israelis and the Jewish people as a whole have an ancient right to the land and are within their rights to control it. Some may even go so far as to argue that international law is a modern creation and disregards the region's entire history, of which these people claim grants Israel the right to this land. Many Israeli citizens may also believe that Palestinians can simply integrate themselves into Israel and become one nation rather than two different states, and as such they believe it is the Palestinians causing the problem and not the Israeli occupation, which they view is for their own security. Some Israelites may also claim that terror groups such as Hamas are seeking to destroy Israel, and as such they need to continue the occupation in order to ensure their nation's security and prevent these terror groups from becoming too powerful and may even potentially control a new Palestinian state. And finally, some may point to the fact that many Jews live in Palestinian territories, and therefore ending the occupation would leave these Zionist communities at threat from the Palestinians. Therefore, occupation should continue, both in order to protect these Jewish people and because Israel opposes the evacuation of the potential evacuation of Jewish settlers from these territories if they were to withdraw their security forces from it. Moving on now to a comparison. Firstly, on the issue of who has the right to this land. Palestinians, of course, say that they do. They say that Arabs have held this land for hundreds of years prior to the 1947 partition, and therefore they have historic rights to this territory. It was theirs and taken from them by the United Nations, and as such, Israel is a foreign state occupying Palestinian lands and should withdraw. Israel, on the other hand, argues that the Jews controlled this land thousands of years before the Palestinians, and it is therefore their ancient homeland, and as such, they have a claim to it. Israel is merely occupying lands that it has a historical claim to. Then on the question of who are the aggressors in this situation, Palestine would argue that the Israeli security forces are the aggressors. They say that they are brutal and authoritarian with Palestinian civilians, and as such, they are breaching the human rights and causing the response from the Palestinian people. Furthermore, they say that ending the occupation would end the aggressive actions of Palestinians and would ensure that both sides can live more peacefully. However, the Israelis claim that the actions of their security forces are merely a response to the terroristic actions of the Palestinians, and they are being forced to react strongly in order to maintain order and security, and therefore the occupation should continue to prevent terrorist groups such as Hamas from having their own state with which they could attack Israel with more effectively. Then on the question of is Israel threatened? Palestinians argue that Israel is often over-aggressive in their actions and are often the cause of many of the states that are opposing them simply because they too are being aggressive on the basis that Israel was aggressive first. And they argue that ending the occupation would encourage a peaceful response from these nations and could actually help to reduce the threat posed to Israel. Israelis, however, claim that they are the victim. They say that they are surrounded on three sides by states which have been hostile to it in the past, and as such, it cannot allow for the creation of another state deep within its own territory which is able to build up armaments against it, and therefore the occupation should continue for Israel's security. On the question of is the occupation legal, Palestinians say that most states globally view Israel's occupation of Palestinian territory as illegal and in breach of international law. Israel in this situation can only act as it is because it is backed up by US military power, and as such, it should end its occupation and follow international law just as the other states do. Israel, however, claims that their actions are legal, as they are in self-defense of Palestinian threats and other foreign threats. Their actions are merely to maintain the security of their nation and their population, and they are acting legally, given that it is again in self-defense. But the question of the Jewish settlers, Palestinians would claim the Jews are illegally settling in Palestinian territory and forcing Palestinians from their homes in order to change the demographic of the region. As they are illegal settlers, ending the occupation would not break any law if it required their withdrawal from the territory. Israel, however, claims that they would not support the evacuation of thousands of Jews from their homes following an end to the occupation. They believe that the Jews have settled legally and they have rights to the land, and Israel wouldn't support leaving Jews to be threatened by Palestine or forcing them to leave their homes during an evacuation of the territory. On the question of Palestinian self-determination, Palestine claims that it has its own right to self-determination as a distinct ethnic and religious group from Jewish Israelites, and as such, the occupation should end and Palestine should be able to form its own state and decide its own future. Israel, however, claims that most Jewish Israelites support the view that Palestinians should integrate into Israel as one nation and should compromise to join the Jewish state, and therefore they believe that Palestinians are in the wrong and believe that the occupation should not be ended for reasons I've already mentioned, and because they believe that it should just be an Israeli state. And then finally, on the question of Jerusalem, this one is a bit different because both sides want the entire city as their capital, and as such, there is no argument revolving around it that really supports ending the occupation, other than the fact that in the future, for example, if Palestine decided not to claim Jerusalem as their capital, then that may support ending the occupation, but for the moment it is only a point of conflict, and there is no feasible solution to this whole question as of yet. Ultimately, those supporting the end of the occupation view it as an illegal act by Israel, and often view Israel as the aggressor in many of these situations, and believe the Palestinians are the victims. However, those supporting the occupation are mainly supporting Israel, and believe that they are threatened by many hostile states, and are merely ensuring the security of their nation, and that it is in fact the Palestinians who are in the wrong. Whichever side you stand on, though, it is very clear that until both sides are willing to compromise and find a solution, there will be no quick fix to such a complicated and problematic situation. And for the foreseeable future, and especially as long as the US continues to support Israel, then the occupation of Palestinian territory, whatever the views of other nations, will continue. What are your views on this topic? Do you think Israel is in the right or wrong, and should the occupation continue or end? And is there anything that I got wrong, or missed, or could do better? Let me know on Twitter or in the comments, and be sure to check back on Friday for another episode. Thank you for listening if you made it all the way through, and I hope to see you all soon.